Yep, my old man was a tough nut, hard act to follow. He was an educated man. He was an athlete. He was capable of tremendous pain thresholds. He was an inspiration in many ways, and I'd like to tell you a couple of stories today about how he came to be known, at least by me, as a tough nut. Charlie was born in Griffintown and then moved to Point St. Charles, the stepping stone of Scottish immigrants in the mid to late 1800s and the early 1900s. It was a school of hard knocks. They were tough neighborhoods. Now they're gentrified, beautiful neighborhoods, but in those days, you learned how to survive and to keep yourself safe and the people you loved safe. In 1938, his parents divorced, which was kind of unusual in Canada. In the previous years, it required an act of parliament to get a divorce, and the law changed, family law changed, and my grandparents were one of the first divorces under that new law. It was a violent, unpleasant family life until he was about 8, 9 years old, and then later he went to live with his grandparents in the leafy suburb of St. Lambert on the south shore of Montreal, and probably that saved him from a life that would have been much more difficult than the one that he had lived. Charlie was a great athlete, as I mentioned, and he played football. He played a full 60 minutes. He played offense and defense. I know he was a receiver on offense. I'm not sure what position he played on defense, but many of the friends that he had in those days went on to play professional football. He didn't. He was a little bit older when that opportunity may have presented itself, and he decided he needed to make a living and feed his young family. So high school and St. Lambert was a period that was very formative for him. He got into trouble with the police over an incident that happened. I believe it happened in Point St. Charles in a diner or a cafe where he used to hang out. And he had a friend who had been in the war. His name was Jerry. I had interactions with him quite a bit in my youth. My dad's office was downtown Montreal, and he used to wander in, and he clearly wasn't, you know, 100 watts, just to say the least. And Jerry had been somewhat of a war hero, and he had had a major head injury. And in this one event, um, he walked into the cafe where my father and his friends were, and he was very drunk, and he was abusive, and he started causing trouble. And the owner called the police. So the police arrived, and they were trying to get things under control. And one of the policemen pulled out his baton and was about to whack Jerry on the head, which my father believed would have been fatal for him. So he leapt to his feet, and he disarmed the policeman of his baton. And there was a struggle. They fell into the coal stove. The pipes came down. Everything fell to the floor in a very dirty mess. And then, of course, my father was the object of the arrest. So he did what all 16, 17-year-olds would do. He took off, and he was running down the street when he heard the cop yell at him, "Stop or I'll shoot." And he looked over his shoulder, and he could see the policeman pulling the gun out, and it was stuck in the apparatus of his holster that had one of those, cross chest straps. So he stopped. They put him in handcuffs. They put him in the car. And during that period in the car where he was unable really to defend himself, one of the cops started beating on him over the seat. This is well before they had separators between the front seat and the back seat in police cars. So the policeman was beating him up, and my father leaned back in the seat and gave him a 2-foot kick right to the jaw, breaking his jaw. So never a good strategy with the police, I guess, but when you're taught to survive and you're brought up in the streets to survive, you don't take kindly to being beaten while, unable to defend yourself. So when they got to the police station, they took him out of the car, and he took off running again in handcuffs. They tackled him in the fire station, arrested him, and charged him. They were going to throw the book at him. Breaking a cop's jaw is never a good thing. And the town of St. Lambert put out a petition, and many co-citizens signed that petition asking for him to be given lenience because he was such a good football player. They wanted him back on the team. The petition had major impact, and the judge threw the case out and gave my father a chance. And I think that was the starting point of him becoming something different than what uh, Point St. Charles and Griffintown might have minted for him originally. From that event, he had been given the nickname Butch. And in my youth, I'd never really met Butch until I was well into my teens. And when I met Butch, I know what they meant by the nickname. So here's my first Butch story. We were living on the farm. I was about 14. Um, my dad had a dislike of hunters and how they treated the land and how they treated the local farmers. Now, there are some very good hunters. We lived in a neighborhood that had a significant amount of people that hunted for food. And he decided that he didn't want hunting on his land. And we were part of the patrol that kept people from doing so. One day I was alone at the farm. I was 14, and some people were walking up the railroad tracks that went through our backyard. And they ended up right behind the house, armed with their hunting rifles and intent on doing so on our land, as we owned the land on both sides of the tracks for about a mile. So I wandered up onto the tracks to ask them to go to the next crossing and hunt someplace else. And one of them put a gun in my face and told me that he'd hunt wherever he wanted to. And I knew who he was. He was a neighbor. We had some neighbors that were a little unsavory, and this was one of them. And neighbor by country measure, so probably about a mile away. And later that day, my father came home and asked me how it was going, and I told him about the incident on the tracks, and he said very calmly, which was his way, get in the car. So we got in the car and we drove up to that neighbor's house, and there they were. They were all sitting on their front porch with their guns, drinking beer. And this was a house that had a slightly elevated front yard with a little stone barrier and a picket fence on it. And my dad and his beaten up 73 Buick Century drove over that barrier and through the picket fence slowly. There was no, rage or anger in his actions. And he drove right up to the front porch, got out of the car, opened the door, looked at me and said, "Which one?" And I pointed to the guy who put the gun in my face. He stood there in front of him, walked up to the porch and said to him, "Do you threaten my kid with a gun?" And the guy said, "Yeah." And my dad said, "You ever threaten my kid again, I'll kill you." Now, I was a little shocked to hear him threaten to kill somebody, but there's just something about when my dad made a threat, nobody doubted that he was serious. Then he slowly got back in the car, and then he backed up and managed to line up the rear of the Buick against the remaining 3 or 4 sections of the fence. And he backed over the entire fence and then slowly drove off the lawn and went home. And we pulled into the driveway. He looked over at me, and I was expecting some great words of wisdom. There were none. He said, "How about a cup of tea?" So that was Charlie when he was riled to defend his domain. He didn't hesitate. He did it with strength. He did it without rage or anger. And he did it in a way that just convinced people that you better listen. On the home discipline front, he was very different than that. My father wasn't violent with us, with my brother and sister and I. He was somebody who focused a lot on reason. He was someone who had studied English literature. After he had come back from that event with the police in St. Lambert, uh, he was kicked out of high school shortly thereafter and never finished high school. So later, he went to university as a mature student and was accepted into Sir George Williams University, which is now part of Concordia University in Montreal, and where he studied English literature as an undergrad and then he later went on to the University of Montreal to do a master's degree in English literature, and was working on his PhD, had finished the coursework, and had begun to work on his PhD thesis when my mother had her first baby, and he decided he needed to go out and make some money to take care of the family. So no more football and no more horsing around. One thing he did do, though, was incorporate all of his learnings from university into his disciplinary tone. One thing he liked to do with me was to quote a famous poem by the British poet Alexander Pope. It was written around the mid 1800s, and it's a very, very long poem. It might be, if I recall, 20, 25 pages. And it was called the Essay on Criticism, and it was written when somebody had, some literary critic had um, published a critique of one of Pope's poems or essays, and he was a young man with a lot of ego, and he decided he was going to ruin this critic by writing this essay on criticism. And if you ever get a chance to read it, it's worth looking it up. There are many expressions in common English language that are used daily that come from that poem. To err is human, to forgive is divine is a good example, or a little learning is a dangerous thing. They all come from that poem. And so my dad, every time I said something smart-assed, would look at me and he would say, a little learning is a dangerous thing. That was his way of saying, shut up and get some wisdom before you express your opinion. Um, but I was a smart ass, so I decided I was going to find that book in his massive collection of books in the house, find that poem and read it end to end, and memorize my own parts of it so I could have some smart ass comebacks to him. So one day I did something that elicited the "a little learning is a dangerous thing," and I responded to him, "Drink deeply, or taste not the Pierian spring. Its shallow draughts intoxicate the brain, and drinking deeply sobers us again." Well, he gave me that look, the butch look, and I thought I was about to see a difference in his disciplinary approach, but he just walked away, and he never quoted Pope again. And for me, that was unfortunate because I was hoping that was going to lead to back and forth for a few years. That would have been educational and entertaining, but you know, for him, that disciplinary tool was no longer available. I hope you enjoyed that story. I've got a few more that I'm going to put together over the next few days about Butch and his escapades and why I feel my old man was a tough nut. Uh, Please like and subscribe, and we'll keep the journey going as long as we can. Have a great day.